Hi, I'm Reverend Jake Sabe, and welcome to Children's Bible Stories. So, Paul and his companions were going around on his missionary journey, and they had now come to the town of Philippi. And Heinrich, why is Philippi important?
Because it's where Paul wrote the epistle to the people in Philippians at the Philippian church.
Yeah, so the epistle to the Philippians, so the book of Philippians in the Bible, that was originally a letter that St. Paul wrote to the church at Philippi. And so this Bible story actually tells us how Paul first established the church at Philippi. And so Paul and his companions came to Philippi. And we don't know exactly who all the companions were with Paul at this point. We could, if we wanted to, sit down and have a guess as to all who were there, because Paul had quite a number of different companions with him on his trips, and some of them stayed with him, some of them went to some places, and then some of them would go to some place for a while and then catch up with Paul at a different place. I mean, if we had enough time, we could probably sit down and go through exactly who was with Paul at Philippi, but we do know that there was at least 3 companions with Paul at Philippi. So there was Paul, but also joined with him was Timothy, who had just joined up with Paul earlier in this chapter. There was also Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. And there's also, of course, Silas. And so, while in Philippi, Paul and his companions went down to the river, where they found a group of Jewish women worshipping on the Sabbath. Now, the reason Paul did this is because even though Paul was known as the apostle to the Gentiles, and Heinrich, who are Gentiles?
People that aren't Jews.
Yeah, so there are Jews and then there are Gentiles. Gentile is the Greek word meaning nations, or everybody who isn't a Jew. And so even though Paul was known as the apostle to the Gentiles because he went and preached to all the Gentiles, Paul had this habit of whenever he came to a town, he would first go to the Jews and then later go to the Gentiles. And so normally when Paul came to a town, he'd go down to the local synagogue, try and talk to the Jews first. If they didn't listen to him, or if they did listen to him, either way, he would then go and start preaching to the Gentiles. But first he'd at least go to the Jews and then to the Gentiles. But Paul didn't go down to the synagogue in Philippi. Instead, he went down to the river where there was a bunch of Jewish women worshipping.
Why?
Well, because we Christians, we teach that Jesus told us wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, there the church is. So as long as you have 2 or 3 people who can gather for church, male or female, we can establish a Christian church. The Jews had a slightly different rule. You needed, I think it was about 7 men in order to establish a Jewish synagogue. And so if there wasn't any men in the town, then the Jewish women couldn't start a synagogue and they had to go worship somewhere else.
Why at the river though?
Well, don't know exactly why, but generally in those days, women would go down to the river to wash clothes or to gather water for drinking, and so the river was probably a place where the women went every day, and so it was probably a safe place that the women could go where they knew they weren't going to be bothered by anyone while they were worshipping God. And so Paul and them came down on the Sabbath and sat with these women, and Paul began to preach to them about Jesus. And amongst the women, there was a lady named
Lydia.
And the Bible tells us that Lydia was what, Heinrich? A
seller of purple toys.
That's right. So Lydia, she had a job selling purple fabrics. And that was normally a high-paying job because in those days, in order to get the purple dye to make purple clothes and purple rugs and etc., the purple dye was something really hard to get, and so it was very expensive. Only kings and noblemen and rich people could afford purple stuff. Now, Paul then preaches to Lydia, and she hears the word of God, and she and her entire household are then baptized by Paul. Now what is interesting though is because Lydia is a seller of purple dyes, this means that she is probably what we call a spinster. That means that she's an unmarried woman. She doesn't have a husband, she doesn't have any children. So when it says Lydia's household, it's probably referring to her servants. Though, since Lydia was a single woman, she probably didn't have any male servants either, so they were all probably female servants. And so it's probably actually Lydia and her female servants who were down at the river that morning worshipping. And so Paul went and baptized Lydia and her entire household. Thanks again, Acolyte Heinrich, for your help. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.